All right, so in this video we're going to look at neuronal pathways of the spinal cord. There's actually four key considerations when we talk about the spinal cord and how it transmits information. The first here is decussation or crossing. So we could talk about how most pathways cross from one side of the central nervous system to the other at some point. And an example we gave earlier was how your right primary motor cortex can control a lot of the muscles on the left side of your body. We also find that when information is transmitted to the brain and spinal cord, there's a lot of relay. And by relay, we're saying that information is transferred from one neuron to another. And there's typically 2 to 3 neurons in this relay pathway. We also find that these pathways have point-to-point correspondence or somatotopy. Remember, soma means body, topy means map. So the somatotopic map is this precise spatial relationship in your central nervous system that correlates with very specific body parts. And then we also find that there's symmetry of these pathways as well. So if there's a pathway on one side of the body, you're going to find it on the other side as well. So the first set of pathways we're going to talk about are the ascending pathways. Remember, ascending is afferent information, which is sensory. So somatosensory signals travel along 3 main pathways on each side of the spinal cord. There's 2 pathways that transmit somatosensory information to the cortex via the thalamus, and there's a 3rd pathway that transmits somatosensory information straight to the cerebellum. So the first 2 that are conscious and go to the cortex are the dorsal column, also called the medial lemniscus pathway, and the spinothalamic pathway. Now the 3rd here, the spinocerebellar pathway, terminates in the cerebellum, and this actually provides important feedback information about your body's position in space. That way the cerebellum can help coordinate and finely tune motor movements. So the dorsal column or medial lemniscal pathway transmits input to the somatosensory cortex of your parietal lobe, and this one's used for discriminative touch and vibration. So when you think of like very precise touch and vibration information, this is going to be transmitted by the dorsal column or medial lemniscus pathway. So this is actually made of paired fasciculus cuneatus and gracilis in the spinal cord, and these actually go through the medial lemniscus in the brain, which is the medulla, to the thalamus. Now once in the thalamus, we'll have these tertiary sensory neurons that then transmit information to the primary somatosensory cortex of your parietal lobe. Now the spinothalamic pathway is made of lateral and ventral spinothalamic tracts, and specifically the spinothalamic pathway transmits pain, temperature, very coarse touch, and pressure impulses along this pathway. So the spinothalamic pathway differs than dorsal column because dorsal column was more precise touch and vibration, whereas spinothalamic is more imprecise touch, pain, temperature, and pressure. Now the spinocerebellar pathway is made of ventral and dorsal tracts, and these ultimately just convey information about muscle and tendon stretch to the cerebellum. And this is actually used to help coordinate muscle activity. So looking at these pathways, what we find here are just cross-sections of different areas of the spinal cord, brainstem, and cerebrum. And what we find here is if for the spinocerebellar pathway, we're going to get information about muscle stretch and tendon stretch, which is transmitted along a primary sensory neuron back towards the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. That synapses on a secondary sensory neuron in the dorsal horn, which then sends its axon up the spinal cord and then synapses on a point-to-point correspondent point in the cerebellum, which would correlate with that specific muscle. And so the spinocerebellar pathway provides very important feedback information about your body's current state and position. That way the cerebellum can use that information for planning and fine-tuning of motor movements. Now for the dorsal column or medial lemniscus pathway, we find that it's made of, remember, the fasciculus cuneatus and fasciculus gracilis, but ultimately these are actually found in the dorsal or posterior part of the spinal cord, hence the name dorsal column pathway. And remember, the dorsal column pathway transmits very precise information about vibration and touch. So whether it's from your hands or your feet, we see that information is transmitted along a primary sensory neuron back towards the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, and then it synapses on secondary sensory neurons, either in the dorsal horn or in the medulla oblongata. And then from there, we have secondary sensory neurons that then send their axons up towards the cerebrum, but they cross in the medulla. So what we find here is that those axons cross from, let's say, the left side of the body towards the right, and then they go up towards the thalamus, where then tertiary sensory neurons then transmit that information to the primary somatosensory cortex of your parietal lobe, but on the right side. So remember, the information came from the left, but it ends up on the right side of your brain. So this is an example of decussation or crossing, where in this example, the decussation occurs within the medulla oblongata. So we're saying that the right primary somatosensory cortex is getting information from the left side of your body. And this is used for more discriminative, touch and vibration, so very precise. Now the spinothalamic pathway, if you remember, was involved with more imprecise pain, temperature, pressure, and touch. And so by imprecise, it's very crude. And so this information is transmitted, again, whether it's from your hands or your feet. So this example is using pain, along primary sensory neurons, where it synapses on a secondary sensory neuron in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, that immediately decussates in the spinal cord and crosses to the opposite side. So we're saying is that the crossing or decussation occurs in the spinal cord at the level of that primary sensory neuron. And then those axons then are transmitted up towards the thalamus. They synapse on tertiary sensory neurons that then send their axon to the primary somatosensory cortex. So again, there's still crossing of information or decussation. However, the crossing occurs in the spinal cord for the spinothalamic pathway. And that differs from the dorsal column or medial lemniscal pathway because that crossing of information occurs within the medulla oblongata. So for the descending or motor pathways, we find that they're differentiated into two main groups. We have direct and indirect pathways. The direct pathways are the pyramidal motor tracts. So remember, we had the pyramidal neurons of our primary motor cortex that actually are involved with somatic motor control, so moving conscious skeletal muscle. And then indirect pathways are everything else. So when you think of like smooth muscle and cardiac muscle and glands, that's going to be controlled by these indirect pathways, also that are unconscious for skeletal muscle. Now, motor pathways involve two neurons. We have upper and lower motor neurons. Upper motor neurons are those which have their cell body in the primary motor cortex or somewhere in the cerebrum. And then lower motor neurons are those which have their cell body in the ventral horn of the spinal cord. And these are the ones that actually directly innervate or connect to skeletal muscle. So the direct pathways are where we have impulses from the pyramidal motor neurons of our precentral gyrus, aka primary motor cortex, and these send their axons down through the lateral and ventral corticospinal tracts. They descend without synapsing until they get to the spinal cord, where once in the spinal cord, those axons synapse with the interneurons of our ventral horn. Now, those ultimately can synapse with another motor neuron in the ventral horn, or they can send their axon directly out to skeletal muscle and therefore control skeletal muscle movements. So think of the direct or pyramidal pathways as being conscious because they control skeletal muscle. So this is showing an example of these direct pathways. And what's interesting is here we have our primary motor neuron, or the upper motor neuron, located in our primary motor cortex. It has its axon that goes down through the projection fibers along the basically cerebral peduncles of your midbrain. And then ultimately, once it gets to the medulla oblongata, we see that it can cross. So when crossing occurs, it can cross to the opposite side of the body, continuing down through other like lateral fasciculi here, and then synapses on interneurons in the ventral horn, which then can synapse on the motor neuron of the ventral horn, which has its axon that leaves the ventral root, spinal nerve, and then synapses directly onto the skeletal muscle here. Or what can happen too is we can actually have the axon continue down the brain, down the spinal cord, but then not cross till it gets to the spinal cord, where the axon crosses through the great commissure and then synapses on the opposite side of the spinal cord ventral horn, and then that goes to muscles on the opposite side here. So crossing for this type of information either occurs within the medulla oblongata or in the spinal cord. So that's for conscious motor control. Indirect pathways are for unconscious motor control. And we call these multi-neuronal pathways. So they're complex and multisynaptic. They include brainstem motor nuclei and all the motor pathways except for the pyramidal motor pathways. And these three pathways regulate things like axial muscles, like for maintaining posture and balance, muscles that are involved with controlling coarse limb movements, as well as those which are involved with reflexes of the head, neck, and eye movements. So there's different types of pathways here that are indirect. We have the reticulospinal and vestibulospinal. These are involved with maintaining balance and maintaining postural muscle control. We have the rubrospinal tracts, which control flexor muscles. And then the tectospinal tract, which is actually associated with the superior colliculi. And these are actually involved with head movements like the visual reflex movements we talked about earlier that help to respond to visual stimuli. So, like for instance, if you see something in your visual field move quickly, the tectospinal tract would automatically adjust your head to adjust your gaze in the direction of that movement. And this is actually a reflexive type of movement. So this is showing an example of the rubrospinal tract, which has its motor neuron in the red nucleus of your medulla oblongata, midbrain rather. That sends its axon down the rubrospinal tract and then goes to the flexor muscles of your trunk and limbs. Now, in terms of developmental aspects of your central nervous system, what's interesting is that your nervous system begins to develop by 3 weeks of an embryo. So the ectoderm thickens, we get the neural plate that forms, and then this invaginates or infolds to form this neural groove, and then we get flanking of the neural folds. Now, ultimately, this crest forms, and then you get migrating neural fold cells that then connect and form what we call the neural tube. That's what we see here. So here we have our ectoderm, and the ectoderm can start to grow and form this neural fold and plate in a very specific area, the midline of the ectoderm. Now, as this begins to grow, and it actually starts to form an infolding here, invagination. That invagination gets deeper as the neural plates get closer together and ultimately forming this deeper neural groove. Now, these cells eventually fuse here so that we actually get a surface layer of ectoderm that will later become things like skin, hair, and nails. And then we get a deeper now layers of ectoderm that will become your central nervous system and associated ganglia. So the neural tube is actually fully formed by week 4, and it differentiates further into the central nervous system. The brain forms on the rostral end, or like just the end that's closest to the nose side. And then the spinal cord forms caudally, or towards the tail side. By week 6, both sides of the spinal cord bear this alar plate and basal plate. The alar plate becomes interneurons, the basal plate becomes motor neurons, and then the neural crest cells form these dorsal root ganglia that are associated. So we find here is the neural tube by week 6. Again, you can see the alar plate, which are sensory interneurons, and then the basal plate, which are motor neurons. We also get the dorsal root ganglia, which comes from our neural crest, and that already begins to associate with the neural tube here. And remember, we have the central cavity, which later we call the central canal, which is the space by which cerebrospinal fluid can flow down. Now, in terms of other developmental aspects of your central nervous system, we find that there are gender-specific areas that can appear in both the brain and spinal cord. Now, what's fascinating here is that the default biologically for males and females is actually kind of to develop on the female pathway. And unless the fetus is exposed to testosterone, you'll find that these brain regions and other tissues of the body won't begin to differentiate into male-like features prenatally. Now, maternal exposure to things like radiation, drugs, and infection can also harm the developing central nervous system. We talk about things like alcohol or opiates that can lead to permanent damage in a developing fetus, even nicotine, as well as infections like influenza virus, rubella, even Zika virus all cause mutations in the developing central nervous system. Now, smoking actually decreases oxygen in the blood, and this can lead to neuron death as well as fetal brain damage. So what we find is that children who are basically exposed to nicotine early on, they actually get permanent changes in their brain that can alter their life moving forward. Now, the hypothalamus is also one of the last areas of your central nervous system to develop. We find that premature infants have pretty poor body temperature regulation, and the visual cortex develops pretty slowly over the first 11 weeks after birth. So it's true that newborns don't really see very well. And then throughout the coming years, we see that neuromuscular coordination progresses from superior to inferior and proximal to distal. So we're saying here is that an infant will begin to be able to lift its head first, as well as its upper appendages first, before be able to sit upright or move its limbs. And those muscles develop proximal to distal. So they're going to be able to move, their shoulder joint muscles first before being able to control their fingers and toes later. Now, age brings some cognitive decline as well, and we see that there's not really significant changes in the central nervous system until you reach your 80s. Shrinkage of the brain can accelerate in old age, and this is due to loss of neurons. And excessive alcohol abuse, as well as other brain injury like boxing, can lead to signs of senility in younger people, but this is actually unrelated to the aging process. So what's fascinating is that alcoholics, as well as people with chronic brain injury like boxers and football players, they actually get signs of dementia at a young age because it accelerates the aging process.